In a previous video, we looked at the pathway of blood through the heart. This time I'd like to take a look at what makes the heart beat itself. I'd like to represent the heart in a very simplified fashion. This will do for the purposes of this video. We have the right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. I didn't draw the valves. Let me just represent the valves in here. And I didn't represent the blood vessels going into the atria or the blood vessels coming out of the ventricles. We don't need them right now. Remember that this heart is actually muscle. It's a different kind of muscle. It's not smooth muscle that operates in your digestive system, and it's not skeletal muscle that makes you move your arms and your legs. It's cardiac muscle. It's a different kind of muscle, and it beats differently. It beats so that it actually squeezes like that, so that when the ventricles are full, they'll squeeze the blood so it can go out the arteries. What we have to consider is what makes them squeeze, what makes them contract in the first place. The answer has to do with two tiny little pieces of tissue called nodal tissue. There's one spot of nodal tissue in the right atrium up here on the wall, and another spot down closer to the valve. Both nodal tissues are in the right atrium. This one that's further away from the valve is the SA node. This one is the AV node. The name obviously represents its location. It's very close to the atrio-ventricular valve. This nodal tissue is very unique because it actually is a combination of muscle and nerve, and it beats on its own. They've taken nodal tissue out of living heart tissue and they put it on a microscope, and they can actually see the cells contracting all on their own. And that's why, if you think about it, when hearts are being transplanted into another person, they're cooled down and everything else, but they're still functioning. They're still able to beat. A heart will beat. Even after it's taken out of the body, it'll beat until it runs out of ATP or it dehydrates. But the heart will beat on its own. That's called an intrinsic heartbeat. So the nodal tissue provides an intrinsic heartbeat, meaning it beats all on its own. What we have to look at in this video is, how does that work? And it all starts with the SA node. This node triggers this node. So the SA node will trigger a contraction. What it does is two things. The SA node causes the atria to contract. So it's the SA node, it's in the atrial area of the heart, so it gets its little contraction and it causes the top parts of the heart to contract. And when they're contracting, obviously, that pushes the blood down into the ventricle. So these contract as a result of the SA node. The other thing the SA node does is it stimulates the AV node. Now the AV node, by extension, should cause the ventricles to contract, but the size of the muscle in the ventricle means the AV node has to be slightly more specialized. The AV node is connected to a bundle of nerves that actually runs down the septum. That bundle of nerves is called the bundle of His. His was, in the 1800s, he was a scientist, he was a biologist, and he discovered this nerve bundle that runs down the septum. The bundle of His divides when it gets down to the bottom where the ventricle muscles are themselves, and it divides into a number of fibers that go all over the ventricle. These fibers are called Purkinje fibers. Again, Purkinje is always capitalized because it was also a person's last name. So now here's what happens. The SA node causes the atria to contract. It stimulates the AV node. The AV node sends a nerve impulse down the bundle of His to the Purkinje fibers, which take the impulse to the ventricle muscle itself, so the ventricles contract in unison. So the AV node goes to the bundle of His, sends a message to the bundle of His, sends a message to the Purkinje fibers, which cause simultaneous contraction of all of the ventricles. Of the entire ventricles. Both of them. So that's what makes the heart beat. And that's why the heart will beat all on its own. If we take a look at the complete cycle, when we have the atria filling with blood, when they stretch, that stimulates this thing, the node, to contract, because it could just sit there, so it fills with blood, stimulates that, stimulates this. That's one whole complete cycle. That's called the cardiac cycle. The SA node, because it's so important, it has a nickname. The SA node is also called the pacemaker, because it sets the pace for the heart. No doubt you've heard of artificial pacemakers. Artificial pacemakers are small electronic devices that people get set inside their skin, and they hook the wires from those little devices up to the heart. They could very well be connected to here, if that's where the electrical stimulation is needed, or another part of the heart if there's some electrical stimulation required in another part to get the heart to beat properly. There's another way to look at this whole picture, and that's what I'd like to present now. If I can get rid of this. The way to look at it is in terms of the electrical changes, because all of this is done because of nerve impulse transmission, and nerve impulses are electrical in nature. And if we take a look at this as saying, okay, there's our electrical energy, and we're not going to worry about units for this discussion, something like that, and this is time. We consider how the electrical energy in the heart changes over time. Okay, and we'll just start with this and say, okay, the heart's not contracting. But then all of a sudden it contracts. The atria contracts, so whoop, there's an electrical change. The atria have contracted. And then nothing happens because the blood is leaving the atria, it's going down to the ventricles, and the length of time that it takes for the atria to stimulate the ventricles by the SA node to the AV node, there's a little bit of time in here, then the atria have stimulated the AV node connected to the bundle of His, the Purkinje fibers, cause the ventricles to contract, ooh, like that. atria contracting, ventricle contracting. This little bit in here, if you think about a muscle contraction, if I were to say to you, I'd like you to jump as high as you possibly can, you're going to do this first, and then you're going to jump. That's exactly the thing that's going on here. The ventricles are massive muscles and they contract, but they recoil slightly before they contract. This little blip here, when they come down or they land or they finish their contraction, there's a bit of a flutter in there. They have a soft landing, same as if you were to jump and touch as far as high as you could. So this pattern is called an ECG, electrocardiogram. This point is labeled P. I don't know who labeled this thing in the first place, but they used the alphabet. It's alphabetically labeled. Each point is given a letter, so we have a P, Q, R, S, T. This is the atrial contraction. This is the ventricular contraction. This, haven't said anything about this yet. This is the ventricular recovery. So there's a wave of electrical change goes through the heart when the ventricles are recovering, getting ready for a subsequent contraction. The time, again, the time, atria contract, ventricles contract slightly later, not much, so there's a period of time in here which corresponds to stimulating the ventricles so that they can get the message out to the Purkinje fibers. Ventricular contraction, this is still part of the ventricular contraction, and then just a split second later, ventricular recovery. And I say a split second, and I say this is time. The total time from one end of this graph to the other, we talk about the beginning of atrial contraction to when atrial contraction could start again for a second contraction. The average length of time here is 0.85 seconds. It's not very long. If you do the math on that, the average heartbeat then is 72 beats per minute. That's 0.85 seconds. So every 0.85 seconds, this whole thing's starting and goes over and goes over again and again and again. And when people have an ECG, they look at it and say, okay, is it a normal pattern? Doctors and nurses who analyze these things, they can look at this and say, oh no, this period of time is too short, or the ventricles aren't contracting properly, this should be a higher peak here, there should be more energy involved here, or the ventricles aren't recovering. There are literally hundreds of different patterns of things that people can analyze in an ECG. We all know that our body's need for oxygen isn't constant. And for that reason, this just represents an average. Our heartbeat does not beat at the same rate all the time. There has to be a way for it to be adjusted, and that way has to do with the brain. Let me redraw that picture of the heart that I had earlier. And represent the SA node here, the pacemaker. The region of the brain that we're talking about is called the medulla oblongata. We can abbreviate it MO. It wouldn't be wise to simply call it the medulla, because the medulla is a term that means the inside part, and there's many organs in the body that have inside parts, like the kidney medulla and the adrenal medulla and things like that. So this is the medulla oblongata, an elongate part of the brain that's actually at the brain stem, the base of the brain where the spinal cord meets the brain. Medulla oblongata is connected to the SA node by a nerve. This nerve is called cranial nerve number 10. It's also called the vagus nerve. The vagus, it's the wanderer. It'll travel around the body. It does a number of things and takes messages to different parts of the body. The part of the nerve that we're concerned about here is the part that goes to the SA node. This brain part here, medulla oblongata, is sensitive to the speed and pressure of the blood as it's going around the body. And if it detects that the blood isn't getting around fast enough, or the blood pressure is a little bit low, it will actually send out a nerve impulse to the SA node and tell the SA node to contract faster. So this whole pattern here will shorten. You'll get the cardiac cycle will take place in a shorter period of time. And then when the need for that oxygen decreases, when things calm down, the medulla oblongata will decrease its stimulation of the SA node. There's another, the body has another specialization that allows the heart rate to be changed. If you remember the aortic arch, which is the part of the aorta that starts in the left ventricle here, it loops around the back of the heart. So it's very hard to draw that, but inside the aortic arch are some specialized spots called aortic bodies. These things are sensitive to the amount of oxygen that's in the blood. So the oxygen that's being delivered to the systems isn't highly oxygenated enough, then it will actually increase the heart rate as well. It'll have the little message go back to the medulla oblongata and speed up the SA node. So there's two ways that your body has that can cause adjustments to what would otherwise be the average heart rate. Thanks for watching again. In the next video, we'll be looking at the fetal circulatory system and how the fetal heart is a little bit different from the adult heart in a number of ways. And if you'd like to be informed of when my next videos get posted, please subscribe. Thanks again.